Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're tackling a massive, globally relevant question. Can social justice actually survive in an era that's completely dominated by global market forces? We're diving deep into Cohen DeFater's academic analysis to figure this out. If you've ever wondered why human rights sometimes feel like they're taking a back seat to corporate profits, well, you are definitely in the right place.
Here's our roadmap for today. We're going to cover 1. What are human rights? 2. Markets versus social justice. 3. The international power imbalance. 4. The war on terror. 5. Avenues of hope. And finally 6. Your CSS exam strategy. Let's get right into it.
Section 1. What are human rights?
So, when we ask what are human rights today, our minds usually go straight to these universal, unshakable ideals, right? We think about inherent human dignity. But Feder's thesis forces us to look past those idealistic definitions and examine the actual reality on the ground. Think about it. In a neoliberal era, are human rights practically treated as universal truths, or are they conditional? To really answer this, we have to look at who's actually holding the power in our globalized society.
And this brings us to the core of the problem. According to the source text, economic globalization operates with what Feder calls cold indifference. Now, it's not that the market actively hates social justice, it's just that it simply doesn't care. It actively subordinates universal human rights to cost-benefit analyses and overall market efficiency. Basically, if a human right gets in the way of a profit margin, the market's cold indifference means economic efficiency wins out.
Moving on to Section 2, Markets versus Social Justice.
Feder highlights a massive hypocrisy in how globalization operates. You see, globalization champions the free, completely unrestricted flow of money and capital across borders. But when it comes to actual human beings, like labor mobility, the borders are suddenly closed up tight and heavily restricted. The source argues that the case for unrestricted labor mobility is honestly just as compelling as the case for capital mobility, and yet only the money is allowed to travel freely.
The text points to specific historical evidence to show exactly what happens when state sovereignty bows to corporate influence. Take the 1990s financial crises in Mexico and Southeast Asia, for example. These highlighted massive economic vulnerabilities when states just lacked domestic capital controls. Or look at the European Union. Despite massive economic liberalization, the new member states absolutely did not see a positive impact on gender pay gaps. The big takeaway here, when states compromise with unfettered markets, it's literally their own citizens who bear the harm.
Let's ground this in a very specific and frankly tragic case study. Brazil's Landless Workers Movement, or the MST. Now, this was supposed to be a market-assisted land reform. Instead, it was a complete failure for the marginalized. The government ended up selling the land to wealthy farmers instead of the landless people it was actually meant to help. And when the landless workers protested, they were met with violence carried out with complete impunity.
The true tragedy of the MST, as Feder notes in a really powerful quote, is that grassroots human rights experiences are literally lost in translation. UN rapporteurs like Asma Jahangir and Jean Ziegler actually highlighted the severe abuses happening in Brazil. But what happened? The official Geneva human rights system completely ignored them. The international system utterly failed to translate local suffering into global action.
Section 3. The international power imbalance.
The explainer source takes strict note of a massive power asymmetry. It argues that powerful developed economies, and particularly the United States, use global financial institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO to essentially dictate the national policymaking of weaker states. It argues this forms a sort of neo-colonialism, where marginalized developing countries have absolutely no voice in deciding policies of quote-unquote universal importance.
So, you might be thinking, why doesn't the UN just step in and fix this? Well, it's a systemic failure. The UNHCR lacks compliance power. It cannot legally bind states, and it has literally no mechanism for sanctions. On top of that, you have massive legal barriers. Complex treaties require expensive lawyers, which effectively denies justice to the poor and illiterate. And this leads to massive regional failures, especially in Africa, which the text notes faces a perennial lack of resources, alongside similar ongoing struggles in Asia and the Middle East.
That brings us to Section 4, the war on terror.
The source text argues that the war on terror fundamentally eroded civil liberties and effectively postponed global social justice initiatives. The entire global focus shifted completely away from development, leaning hard towards security policies that, according to Feder, triggered equally transgressing human rights violations. This included disproportionate warfare and a total breakdown of basic legal protections.
Looking at the shift before and after 9/11,
There was initially a real global focus on universal rights, fair trials, and the Millennium Development Goals. The post-9/11 reality, however, according to the source, saw interrogations outsourced to private firms just to bypass the law. The text notes credible evidence showed that abusive treatments were orchestrated, not random. And perhaps the most damaging part for global poverty? Traditional development aid was simply relabeled and quietly redirected right into security programs.
Section 5. Avenues of Hope.
Okay, so the crucial point is, what can actually be done here? How do we fix a system where markets and security constantly override human dignity? Well, FATER provides some concrete recommendations. First and foremost, human rights must legally override trade law. Second, even if a state privatizes essential services like healthcare or education, it retains its human rights obligations to its citizens. You just can't outsource your responsibility. Third, we need stronger global accountability and actual reparation mechanisms. And finally, ensuring unhindered migration and protecting refugee rights to balance out that free flow of capital we talked about earlier.
Because the state-centric UN systems and the Geneva system so often fail to enforce these reforms, the text highlights what it calls avenues of hope. These are incredible grassroots successes filling the gaps left by governments. We're talking about things like people's tribunals popping up in Brazil and Germany, active trade unions and NGOs like SERAC in Nigeria fighting for economic and social rights. These movements prove that social mobilization can act as a hugely powerful corrective to the failures of both governments and markets.
Finally, Section 6, your CSS exam strategy.
So to construct a really solid 20-mark essay out of all this, instructor Tausif Iqbal Khan provides this specific 4-part framework. You're going to start with the problem, market forces overriding human rights. Then you agitate that with the evidence, bring in IMF policy asymmetry, the post-9/11 security shift, and that Brazil MST case study. Next, explain the obstacles, the lack of UN compliance, and those complex legal barriers. And finally, provide the solution, FATER's recommendations, and the power of grassroots tribunals. This framework gives you a logical flow that proves to the examiner you deeply understand the material.
So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a rather provocative question to consider. What happens to our global society if human rights continue to be treated as just another line item on a corporate cost-benefit analysis? The survival of social justice depends entirely on how we answer that. Now, to help you answer complex questions like this on test day, don't forget to subscribe to Dawn Times for more essential content, and definitely be sure to reach out to instructor Tausif Iqbal Khan for top-tier CSS preparation. Thanks so much for learning.